this issue of speaking up, advocacy, I'm particularly interested in those moments that each of us have to speak about an idea that maybe came from inside of us that maybe care a lot about. I'm really interested in those moments when we're speaking up on behalf of our own ideas, because I do think that that's when the many thousand-year-old history of who is allowed to do such things really plays on each of us.
Hi, I'm Chloe Deco, and with more than a decade of experience working with thought leaders, I've witnessed firsthand the impact of conviction combined with purpose-driven entrepreneurship. This podcast shows you how to authentically bring together leadership, equity, and marketing to build your authority so that you can grow your impact and scale your business. This is a space for elevating women's voices and redefining what it means to be a thought leader. Together, we'll unlock the potential of our bright voices and create a ripple effect of change that resonates far beyond the realms of business. This is the Bright Voices in Business podcast. Now let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the Bright Voices in Business podcast. Today, I am joined with Samara Bay, who is a keynote speaker and the best-selling author of Permission to Speak. She has consulted for Hollywood actors, politicians, and rising leaders in all areas. Through her work, Samara is changing what power sounds like. Hi, Samara. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Hi. Hi, everybody.
Hi. I'm so excited for this conversation because I think when we talk about our voices, that can be a huge can of worms, really. And that's why it's so wonderful to have a book like yours that we can talk more about as we go. But there's a lot of insecurity, I think, that can prevent women from pursuing thought leadership, speaking up in a room, challenging opinions, maybe saying the hard things or taking a keynote stage. Yeah. There can be a lot there. And so your book was this beautiful dichotomy almost of like, yes, all those things can be true. And we can both challenge the systems of which have created what this voice of power sounds like. And there are ways for us to work within that system as it is today. And I know for me, that's been an ongoing battle of trying to figure out what does authority actually sound like when we think about thought leadership or leadership in general. And then also, how do you do that, but also be authentic all at the same time? So thank you so much for joining me and just opening up this dialogue. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, those are the big questions. And, you know, coach to coach, I think it's important to acknowledge that these are not just theoretical questions. I mean, I'm like totally into getting philosophical here. And the reason I wrote the book is because I actually want us to solve this for each of us in, you know, not only our own lifetime, but like on a day-to-day basis. And especially this issue of speaking up, advocacy. I'm particularly interested in those moments that each of us have to speak about an idea that maybe came from inside of us that maybe care a lot about. And it's not just speaking up on behalf of others. That is incredibly important, and I am not here to undervalue that at all. But I'm really interested in those moments when we're speaking up on behalf of our own ideas, because I do think that that's when the many thousand-year-old history of who is allowed to do such things really plays on each of us. And it doesn't always obviously show up as like big cultural stories. It shows up in our own head as, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Why can't I hack it? Why can't I show up? Why am I freaking out? Me, right? And that's the part where I just like to hold all of our hands, myself included, and be like, we're actually doing something really big right here. That speaking up on behalf of our own ideas thing, that feeling the nerves and doing it anyway thing, that bringing our own sense of mischief or delight or joy just a little bit more into that process thing is really radical.
I can see how much this lights you up too, which is such a beautiful thing to see. Yes, I want to talk a little bit about your story with this because it's deeply personal. And I know it's deeply personal for everybody, but kind of how you got into this work is a symptom, really, of the bigger problem that we're talking about and how that showed up in your day-to-day life. So do you mind sharing a little bit about kind of your origin story?
Yeah. Well, I have two. So I have an origin story that is total. I think it's what you're suggesting, and I'm going to tell that. But also, I do have the story of how I figured out that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Because at first, I was just sort of somebody who was experiencing how crappy stories about my own voice were playing out in my own life, and then I was somebody who was coaching it in this completely fresh way. And like, whoa! I had a whoa. I had a whoa. So yeah, the first story is that when I was in my 20s. I was in the middle of an acting program, a graduate school program at Brown in Providence, Rhode Island. And in the very middle of this 3-year conservatory experience, I lost my voice. And it happened over many months. And I was not sick. I didn't have any other symptoms, but my throat was hurting so badly that I would like gently experiment with talking in the mornings. And by midday, it'd be gone. And by night, I would be, huddled with tea and a blanket in this little guest house I was renting, feeling this like real weight of existential crisis of like, I mean, you can tell already, those of you who are listening, I'm chatty, right? And I lost it. I lost my ability to communicate. And I was still going to class because when you're not sick, you still go to class, but no one paid any attention to me. I was like a ghost. And that whole era was just so confusing and, like the physical feeling of disempowering. And I finally got myself to an ear, nose, and throat doctor who stuck a camera up my nose and down the back of my throat, this little tiny thing they call a scope. And I got a picture of my vocal cords. And from that, it was clear that there was a matching blister on each side of the V-shaped vocal cords. And that is, as it turns out, a telltale sign of vocal nodules. And I got back to class the day that I got that diagnosis, and I'd missed the morning session. And the guy who ran the whole program in front of all my classmates, he stopped everything and he said, "So, Samara, what's the diagnosis?" I was like,
way to call you out.
Totally. And like, I don't know, I feel like he violated like 3 HIPAA rules. But anyway,
absolutely.
It was the early 2000s. What did I know? And in the doorway, I stopped and I said as loudly as I possibly could through these like inflamed vocal cords, "Vocal nodules. I have to go on vocal rest, like true vocal rest." And he said, I'll never forget, just as I thought, bad usage. Right. It's like such a weird phrase. It's not like it means anything, but I felt it. I still feel it every time I tell this story. It was like this ball of shame he was throwing at me. Yeah, totally. You got injured. Bummer. You did it to yourself.
Yes, I think the shame is so, really, this is what it comes down to. There's all this shame that we carry. And I know you're going to get into this, but like around things that we don't have any control over or didn't realize, was happening. And that really prevents a lot of this.
Right. And this is why I tell the story, because it's not like that was like trauma with a capital T. But I'll say this, that little shame ball stuck with me much longer than the actual vocal issue did. I went to a speech pathologist over Christmas break. She was awesome. I circled back and interviewed her for my book 20 years later. She's delightful. And I solved the problem. But that shame situation actually took way longer to process. And I didn't have the tools. And in fact, when I was finishing writing this book, I wrote the intro at the end. And only then did it hit me that this is literally what I needed. This is the book I needed in my 20s when I was like, why would I self-sabotage myself to this extreme? But, I tell the story because I think many of us have versions of the story. Somebody told us that we talk too loud, that our voice is annoying, that our laugh is annoying, that we sound ditzy, that we sound like a man, that we sound like a child. And we don't just hear that feedback and instantly metabolize it like, oh, interesting. I wonder what other options I have at my disposal. No, we go, what's wrong with me? Why would I have picked up a habit that is undermining my own credibility or my own authority? And the answer, fortunately, we have many of them. The answers have to do with the ways we have picked up the lessons of our culture and specifically the lessons of certain rooms. We are all brilliant at making micro adjustments to get by. And some of that means that when we were 2, we noticed what made the people who were, caretaking us turn toward us instead of away from us. Or when we were 8, what made the kids in class laugh at us or not laugh at us? We make adjustments accordingly, and they're usually for risk management or self protection, or maybe to stand out, to be liked, to be approved, to be seen as charming, right? We experiment. We're like all just little mad scientists being like, ooh, that one tends to work. When I talk like that, I seem tough. Oh, that's fun. I think that's why my, own stuff happened. Or when I talk this other way, I seem really unintimidating, or I seem really smart. So fortunately, there's this huge gift from linguistics. Sociolinguists will tell us that every habit vocally any of us have picked up, we have picked up for a reason. It has served us. So then we get to use that as a very, very, very loving launch pad to go, in what ways is it still serving us? In what ways is it not? How much variety do I have? This isn't like throw all your habits out the window. This is notice the ways you are with your best friends. Notice how you seem when you feel free and you have nothing to prove. What is in there that we might be able to bring into those higher stakes moments when we are talking about what's close to our heart and the stakes feel high?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about where this conditioning comes from. I know in your book, you talk about how we're raised and the areas of the country we live in, our friend groups. There's a lot of
like literally everything. Yes, literally everything.
gender stereotyping happening, a lot of this.
Yeah.
And there's this reality that that's part of it. And there's also the fact that we have to work within the reality right now. I want to give an example of why this feels so prevalent to me right now. So at one of the companies I worked with, there was a coworker of mine who was a lot more timid in the way that she spoke. And the feedback as her manager that I would get from other leaders in the organization was that she did not speak with enough authority to be taken seriously as somebody who would be in a leadership position. And so I had to figure out, how do I share this information with her and this feedback with her in a way that is like kind and tender and loving and helps her grow? And what I realized through the process, it wasn't until actually after I had left the organization, but what I realized in the process was this kind of prevalence towards maybe the way I spoke versus the way that she spoke in those situations. And yet I also started to internalize the feedback for her, for myself. And so it prevented me from doing things like starting a podcast until I could work through that belief or fear. But it wasn't until after I left the organization that I realized, or had learned, I think it was through Colleen Bordeaux actually, that criticizing of vocal fry and upspeak and all these different kinds of, you'll use right terms better than me, but linguistic ways of speaking are really a form of policing women's voices or voices in general. And so curious if you could shed just like a little bit of light on, I know this can be a can of worms, but a little bit of light on where that really comes from, this policing, and then how can somebody, knowing that this is part of the world we live in, how can somebody navigate this in a way that can be successful for them?
Yeah. So much in there. And there is also a tendency, I think we all have, to make it more black and white than it really is. So there is this, as I call it, the old sound of power. I do not mean it in a bad way. It's just a chance for all of us to talk about standards. So there are sort of substandards in any of our industries, right? There's like a standard when we sit down in an airplane and the pilot comes over the speaker, we kind of expect what that pilot's going to sound like. And if they sound different, not only are they a woman, but let's say they just don't use the cadence that we're used to hearing when there's turbulence, we actually freak out because the norm is a norm. The standard is set in place for a reason and we're all used to it. Not to say you shouldn't do it the other way. I'm just saying that our ears are going to pick up if there is a disruption in the norm, a turbulence, if you will, in the norm. So that happens, right? Yoga teachers, there is a whole norm there. Journalists, there's a whole norm there. And for any of you who are thinking about, your office, and you know what office culture sounds like, you know what meeting culture sounds like, you know what meeting culture where that person leads versus that person leads. So just naming standards so that we know that when we are experimenting with deviations from the standard, stuff's going to come up. We're going to feel things. We're feeling a disruption, a turbulence in the norm. Oh my God, I'm such a nerd. So gray area, because it's not always If I experiment with new ways of speaking that aren't what that standard is, I will be penalized. No one will take me seriously. That is the fear. And in some rooms and with some ears, that will be the case. And we can't control everyone and we can't control everything. And it's frustrating. And there is just this huge, beautiful, messy gray area of if I begin to speak on my own convictions with a little bit more fire, a little bit more of my own spirit, not someone else's. If I take a breath from a lower place and it activates me in a way that takes up more space than I did yesterday, am I going to be penalized? The answer may very well be no. It may very well be that no one even totally sees the difference, except that they're like, wow, you were really on today. Or when you talked about that thing, I really cared about it. I'm like, now I'm like invested. I want your idea to become office policy. People's reaction may very well be, now I care about your thing too. Not, wow, you're showing up in a different way, but maybe you were showing up in a different way. So I think it's helpful to notice when the voices in our own head are basically saying there's one standard of how people are supposed to show up in public and I'm not doing it, so I'm doing it wrong. And then start to, lovingly consider if that story is serving you and is building the kind of world that you would like to live in. And just to name the standard, right? Like, yes, we can totally just say it's like the straight white man, like rich land owning, stoic man vibe. But it's even more specific than that. If you Google, how do I sound more authoritative, which we can imagine many, many people have, because as soon as you Google it, 5 little bullet points pop up and they pop up in half a second, as you do with the Google. They're really granular. The first one is look confident. So ha 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 ha, whatever, right? Like there's some sort of like,
whatever that looks
like. Sort of like width or puffing up. Like I don't know. I ask rooms of people when I'm doing workshops, what is this? And everyone does the same body language. It's like suddenly you're like taller in your spine and your shoulders are like twice as wide. Okay. So look confident, but all the other ones are vocal. There's make sure that you speak with your voice going down at the end. So this is obviously a conversation about upspeak, which would be the alternative, right? So for any of you who have been given feedback that you go up at the end of your sentences or make statements sound like questions, this is why you're getting that feedback, because obviously Google is not just independently coming up with this list. It is a amalgamation of the, what do we call it? Common wisdom, like the conventional wisdom. Like, I don't know if that's actually wise, but it is conventional wisdom. Go down at the end of your sentences. The other thing about going down at the end of your sentences is that you're making sure that nothing is open for debate, right? Because questions are also openings and statements that go down at the end are closings, just energetically. Another one is, speak with a lot of emphasis. So I'm guessing this means that like you should just randomly punch a bunch of things that you're saying as you say them, right? I already sound more like bro culture. Voila, there you go. Another one is speak with a lower pitch. So just naming that vocal cords are like string instruments. The shorter the string, the higher the pitch. And women, by and large, just have shorter vocal cords. It's anatomical. Why is an interesting question. I mean, I get into the like evolutionary what the fuck of that, but nonetheless, science, higher vocal cords, higher pitch rather, shorter vocal cords, higher pitch. So if anybody's ever told you that your pitch is too high and no one will take you seriously, well, that's what happens when the standard is set to man, right? And then it's obviously messy inside of that too. And I'm, as you can tell, very gray areas. So like maybe those of you who are listening to me saying this are also like a tiny bit aware that you maybe talk a little bit higher than you even need to, or than might be your body's natural pitch, because I like to call it Starbucks voice. We all know the benefit of being able to say, hi, so sorry, the Splenda's out. So I was just wondering if you could refill it. Right? Like that voice is useful. It's very unintimidating and it often gets us what we want to a point when there isn't a power exchange that needs to happen. Right. So this stuff is just so deliciously messy. And then, the Google, what did I leave out? There's like 1 or 2 other ones that Google will tell us. But these are the things that when somebody breaks them, I either get the message from management or we get really lit up. I mean, I don't mind when somebody uses like and and it often is a sign that they talk like they're friends. It's often a sign that they are thinking fresh thoughts in the moment and thus using linguistic markers of fragmented thought to say, not quite done with that thought, trying to figure out what I really mean, right? To me, it's a sign of not just authenticity, but trustworthiness, emotional availability, right? We're all terrified of seeming too angry or too teary or too optimistic, hopeful. These big shows of emotion, that's what vulnerability means, right? We show someone we care and now they know. And yet, if we think about who we love listening to, right? Which speeches go viral, they're doing all that. They're really emotionally available. So now the old sound of power story begins to kind of fall away. And it's not like there's that way to sound authoritative and every other way is like a good fucking luck. It's like, well, actually, the story's already changing. The question is, do we want to grab onto the new diversity of standards and allow that to give us permission to show up in fresh ways when we have the chance to talk?
Yes, I love the kind of depiction of this being a gray area because there is so much involved in all of this and what creates our individual voice story, which I would love to talk about.
Yeah, well, and even like to get back to the exact story that you shared, right? And I would be very curious to hear more. I think we probably all would on like how you actually navigated giving her that advice. But, you know, what we're talking about in that context is executive presence, this concept that is meant to capture the spirit of people who just seem like leaders. And I think inside of that is more interesting questions than just should we sound like a boring man or not. There's interesting questions in there about like, well, I don't know, what kind of leadership do we want to see more of in the world? What kind of leaders do we like? What kind of leaders are already, you know, breaking the mold? The Obamas and the Oprahs of the world, right? Esther Perel, like who do we listen to? And we just go, I just wish everyone who was in charge of the world was as unique and free and powerful in your way as you. So then also there's this question of power, right? Like, of course we know that there are all kinds of cultural stories about the misuse of power. And then we also are like, okay, cool, but I want more power. And what does that mean when I say I want more power? Does it mean I want more decision-making power? Probably, yeah. But also I want the power to, I don't know, set the tone. I want tone setting power. Like that's right? It's not like me having more of that is at a disadvantage to anyone else, right? We're out of the zero sum version of power now. We're in the like vibe rise version. How do I raise the vibe for everyone? This is really, I mean, I'm sort of deliberately making this as messy as possible. Like, and it's this and it's this and it's this, because I really do think that this is what's at stake when we start to think about it's not just I have to go pitch this idea to that room and they have money and I don't. It's what is the thing I'm pitching? How big can I make its value to the people of the world at large? Or, you know, what is the ripple effect? How much can I believe in that value to the extent that when I go into that room, I know those folks are going to also benefit? And how can I go in and even though I have the least amount of power in the room because they have all the money and I need the money, I nonetheless enter that room like I have the most amount of power, vibe rise kind. And I'm going to take such good care of them and I'm going to bring them in on this extremely valuable idea of mine in such a like real and playful and powerful way that they're going to want to, of course, invest in it. And I, you know, obviously coach people on this kind of pitching. It's just like, it's like if the entire world has told us that public speaking of all kinds, speaking on a stage, pitching your idea, speaking on a podcast is fear-based, right? I hope I don't fuck it up. I'm lovingly offering the alternative. We know the opposite of fear is love. So what is a love-based approach? Well, obviously it feels more fun, but also it's like putting how much we care at the center of public speaking. And if we don't care, that's interesting, right? That's complicated. But if we do and we're hiding it, that's just socialized stuff. And it does stuff to our voices. And we get to inquire, get curious. How's it doing? How's it working out for me?
Yeah, it sounds like really there's a lot of heart and love at the center of all of this. And I know in your book, you also mentioned conviction, and conviction is a word that I think is really important in thought leadership, like really believing in what you have to say and share up with the world. And yet we don't want to force conviction. We want to have authentic conviction. So how can somebody figure out really how they're showing up authentically in this space, making sure that they actually give a shit about what they're talking about and in their pitch and in their presentation and all those kind of avenues where they can share their message.
Well, there is something to finding it, right? So I think when I try out a new thought, I write a weekly Substack. So I'm sort of forcing myself in a way to enter the public arena with new thoughts. When I try a new thought out, like I think this is how things work, or I think that working on this in private will actually help in public. Your conviction does not have to be, I no longer think I know for sure. This is not an obligation we have. If we feel that we have that responsibility, it may be somebody else's voice in our head, right? But we do have an obligation to really do the inquiry on, do we care about this? If we don't care about it, don't talk about it. Unless, of course, we're in some sort of a corporate context or we're speaking on behalf of someone else and there is an obligation, right? Okay. But otherwise, figure out what we care about. What are you fighting for? What are you fighting for? What is worth fighting for inside of this thought? What do you believe? These are such they're juicy and they're sometimes painful questions because we, especially as women, have this socialized disconnect sometimes between our desires and ourselves, right? If you ask a room full of tired moms, what do you want? A few of them would say the obvious, I need my spouse to step up, right? These kinds of real fiery short-term, like survival wants. But what do you want? Like, if you had a week, what would you do with it? That kind of want. We tend to go kind of blank. And this is, welcome to being a woman. Like, there are all kinds of reasons that we're told that our desires are dangerous. So what I'm really suggesting, if we're talking about the care game, if we're talking about how to prep for a pitch or how to prep for something, is to really figure out, what is the big swing here? Would really, in my body, not just my mind, feel like a huge yes? What would feel like a hell yes? And if it doesn't come right away, keep searching, right? Ask friends, get in conversation, get messy.
Yes, definitely experimenting and testing and trying out words and phrases to figure out. For me, I find it when I start to almost go on a rant or some sort of thing. And I feel this fire in my belly and I'm like, oh, wait, hold on. I care about this.
They're so useful, right? Trying to catch ourselves in those moments is hard because they're when we're the least self-conscious, but it's so useful. I do believe that's where this book came from. I do think, yes, exactly what you said, that I was like, every time I talk about this, it fires me up.
Yes. Or surround yourself with people who will point that out to you.
Yes.
If you're having a hard time doing that for yourself. So I know my husband will be like, you sound really passionate about this. I'm like, oh, wait, you're right. I am.
Interesting, right? And there is some digging there too, because sometimes we get, one of my favorite quotes, Rebecca Traister, who wrote this great book called Good and Mad. She said, I went and heard her speak live when she was on the book tour for that. And she said, women's anger diagnoses social injustice. So of course we can apply this instantly to marches and things. But I think there's something else really, really provocative and useful there, which is that when we get really pissy about something tiny, we can perhaps dismiss ourselves. Ugh, can't you just get over it? And there is an invitation, I think, inside of what Rebecca Traister said, which is that if we're finding ourselves feeling really pissy about something that seems tiny, maybe just explore that. Is there an injustice in there? Is there something that actually feels like it ties in to some unfairness? And is it a type of unfairness that someone else in your life might be feeling too, that might actually be happening at scale elsewhere?
Yes. I remember when I went through coaching education, they talked a lot about how values can show up in the ways that you feel fulfilled, but they're also, when we get pissed about something, even if it's something small, it's usually because of a value of ours is being stepped on or not honored by either ourselves or other people. And so usually if you get, if you're cut off in traffic or, somebody doesn't pick up their laundry, whatever it might be, it's usually a symptom of some sort of value of ours, which is bigger and grander than the actual act itself, that is not being honored.
It's such a good reminder to look for that. If we just jump straight to, why are you letting this get to you, right? We are missing the opportunity to learn something about ourselves and our values.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because I think those who read your book, which they absolutely should, but if they don't, I do want them to understand the connection between our voices and the space we take up. And there's almost, to me, like what I was hearing through your book was also our voices are one of the ways in which we can be seen, not just heard. And so, and being seen includes what we look like and taking up space. And I know you mentioned Sonia Renee Taylor's book a couple of times in your book, Permission to Speak. And I feel the connection is so obvious now that I've read both books.
Right? Your body is not an apology and your voice is not an apology is like so real. Yeah.
Yes. Can you share a little bit around, like, as I was reading your book, I was like, oh, I should probably not be wearing pants that are so tight around my waist so that I can actually breathe and then I can sound better.
The breathing thing. Yes. Yeah. I mean, look, first of all, I'll say this, what you've already said for any of you listening, right? What Chloe's already said, right? It's already, you get it, right? There's our voices and our bodies are two different ways that we are taking up space in the world and they're connected. But I specifically want to name that as I was thinking about why was I writing a book on public speaking? This like kind of old timey phrase, public speaking. I thought, hiding inside of that is this word public. And the reality is that it wasn't that long ago that women leaving their house unchaperoned was basically illegal. 120 years ago in New York City, you couldn't enter a bar as a woman alone. You couldn't walk around. If you walked around alone in broad daylight, people either assumed that you were merely moving from one house of employ to another, or that you were a prostitute, which was, by the way, called a public woman. So the public, wandering freely in, the public, was the realm of men. And this seems on the one hand obvious, but on the other hand, I think for me, but also for like every client I've ever worked with, it helps to acknowledge that, 100 years ago might be a long time ago for us, but it wasn't for our grandmothers who raised our mothers, who raised us. And that when we began to have a bit more freedom, hard earned freedom to leave our houses unaccompanied, like a person who just does what they want, we were not instantly also given a generous ear audience who was happy to hear what we had to say. And we still might not. And that is the reality. Like, what finally got women out of the house in this like socially acceptable way was department stores. It was a grab for our wallets. It worked. Suddenly there were outdoor, indoor, public, private spaces, right? It's the gray areas began. Cool. But, buying a new dress for yourself or buying whatever, like some beautiful decor for your house, discovering that you had buying power and thus, capitalism wanted you, is not the same thing as standing on your own conviction in front of a room and trusting they won't move. So when we talk about taking up space, it's literally the physical spaces that we enter in order to give, say, a formal speech at a conference or to speak to that boardroom. That building was not built with us in mind. It just wasn't. And so here we are. And if we find that we are not breathing deeply, it's a combination of just socialized stuff. All of us are pretty bad at breathing deeply. It's ridiculous. Like we breathe just enough to get by. But, there's this amazing interview from a study from a woman who discovered this concept of email apnea, that we hold our breath when we read an email as though we're bracing for bad news and then we forget to let it go. And so we all just are like holding in some stale, crappy, CO2 breath and just breathing enough to literally not die, but not more than that. Okay. So there's that going on. There's also, especially for women, a lot of stuff around our middles, right? And like what I call suck-in culture, but this idea that we can actually control how thin we seem in that one part of our body. So why not? Mixed in with the fact that that area is also a really juicy place to hold in trauma and various stressful things that muscles know how to hold on to. And then there is this thing of I'm walking into a room that was not made for me with a bunch of people who are not expecting me to show up whole, and I'm bracing for what might happen. And the best way to brace is to tighten our middles, hold our breath, and kind of be in armored, ready mode, as though nothing can phase us.
That survival.
Yeah.
In your book, you talked about removing the armor and taking off the masks. And you did this beautiful meditation around that and allowing that to have you show up in your day to day. Can you talk a little bit about love and why that's important in all of this?
Yeah. I mean, the disclaimer is that it's really not my job to tell people to take off their mask if they know that they're not safe. Right? Like, I'm just not in the room that you're in. And I just, part of this work is for everybody to feel as empowered as you can, to trust your own instincts. This is not me trying to override your instincts. And sometimes we are holding on to more armor than we need to. And it's getting in the way of our destiny. And that's the part where I'm like, what is that gray area? Where is that part where we're actually telling the story longer than the story needs to be told? That is a meditation that I got from a woman named Lori Snyder, who does yoga stuff and especially runs meditations and yogas for writers. So part of what she's interested in and why I asked her permission to use it is that before we do something creative, it is useful to notice what armor we're holding on to. That, and maybe armor isn't the word for you, but that sense of rigidity, that sense of here's how it's going to be, maybe it's perfectionism, is often counter to our creative, free-spirited, who knows whatness. That who knows whatness, the surprise element, the spontaneity, the, just like that creative hit of like, whoa, that's a thought, which, like, now that I'm doing the Substack, it's a different pace than the book. I had a year and a half on the book. So, that could sort of like slowly massage itself out. But now it's like weekly. So I have a little note to myself on my computer here that says, pay attention to my life and write things. Like, pay attention to your life part, right? This is creative hits. This is actually like not just being in your life, but allowing it to also like have this other second life happen inside your own head and trusting that that's right, that my thoughts are good, that they're enough, that they're useful to other people. I'm an entrepreneur, but I'm also an artist. And like, these terms are just things that people play with, that I play with. It's not like they need to be one or the other. But I do notice when I have my entrepreneur hat on, sometimes I'm thinking, what do I need to do? What are the rules? How does this work? How does this work? How does this work? How do I figure out the puzzle? The puzzle is a puzzle. And as soon as I put my artist hat on, I'm like, oh, I am the rule. The rules are me. The rules are whatever that I'm a breaker of rules. Like, it's a totally different vibe. So I guess that's a very long way, or like a teasing out of this idea of taking the armor off and seeing what's behind the mask and behind that mask and behind that mask, as an invitation not to do something that does not feel safe or responsible, but rather for something that gets you to connect with that the rules were not meant for me version of yourself. I talk a lot about mischief, and I think that this is where that comes in, right? The idea of being a troublemaker, not in these huge ways that are going to like burn all the bridges, but just in this, sort of whisper of get in trouble and what that might open up inside your own mind.
I love that example because it helps us not get into the problem solving mode of like, how am I going to make this work? But really lean into more of like a playful, mischievous world in which there might be better answers.
Yes. It's so annoying, right? Because we want to control everything. If I just solve the problem, it won't be a problem. And instead, the way to solve the problem is usually to be like, the solution is flow. The solution is love. The solution is friendship. It's like, oh, right. I just have to actually like live and, be open instead of closed.
So instead of throwing spaghetti, we should be throwing paint, is what I'm hearing.
Oh, I like that.
Awesome. So with all of this, and I appreciate you getting messy with me here because it is a messy topic and there's so much involved in it. I'm curious if you have a couple of like takeaways that someone listening could just implement, today or tomorrow as they're thinking about this topic that maybe they haven't created space to really think about before.
Yeah.
What could they implement?
Okay, I have two thoughts. So I'm going to pull at things I think I've sort of slightly already mentioned, but get more, coachy, practical. One is make a list for yourself. And it could just be like an ongoing, thing on your desk or whatever that you just jot down or on your phone. But make a list for yourself as you think about people. You just love the way they show up. You just love it. Like there's something that just makes you lean in. So maybe it's your favorite podcasts. Maybe it's, your favorite like random speeches, not the official formalized ones that happen at award ceremonies, but like somebody stood up at a town hall and something happened that just felt really fresh. Maybe it is the more formalized one. Maybe it's TED Talks, right? Maybe it's somebody in activism or politics, but maybe not at all. Maybe it's the artists in your life. Maybe it's someone in your life that the rest of us wouldn't know. And I don't, if you're like, yeah, but they don't talk in public, right? That you can be looser about that, right? The rules don't apply to us. But really do start to think, who is not just like who society has spoon fed me I'm supposed to like, but when I hear somebody, who's the one that like makes something happen in my body, right? The body doesn't lie. What is that like visceral response? And allow that list of people to grow and start to notice trends, right? So it's not like I'm suggesting you should now sound like any of those individuals. But there are new stories that start to emerge around, for example, emotional openness or an accent that tells us where someone's from instead of a general accent that doesn't. There's stories that start to emerge, and let them. And you can talk about it with friends and collect with each other, right? And there's this sort of like collective reshaping of quote unquote conventional wisdom. So that's one. And two is take seriously, in like a playful way, take seriously what like a 2-minute warm up would be that would feel good in your body and your spirit before you have the chance to do any kind of anything, right? A podcast interview or run a training or, whatever, like define this broadly enough that you actually do it. What would be a 2-minute warm up? So for me, it requires one, a reminder that I'm breaking some rules here, that it's helpful to be like, the history of public spaces reminds me that showing up is a radical act. Okay, so that's one. Two, something physical, right? For me, I've done yoga for 20 years. It's really helpful to just do some, downward dogs to notice the parts of my body that always are stiff or crunchy and to just, loosen them up. I think it's helpful for everybody to do like spine twists of some sort, even if you just do it for 10 seconds, standing up and moving your torso to the right and to the left and letting your body show you what feels good. So the body part, they used to say do jumping jacks and get out of breath. Yeah, sure. Yeah, right. Like whatever works. 3, something more mouthy, more like, how are my lips doing? Your lips and your tongue tend to hold a lot of tension. Your tongue connects down to your throat. I mean, actually, I don't know if throat's the right word, but on the outside, it connects down to your neck. That's a huge muscle and it holds a lot. It just like tenses up when we're driving, when we're, I live in LA, when we're like maybe texting and driving, like, stuff tends to happen. And then we need to actually let ourselves loosen it with some silliness. And the final thing is bring to mind a memory of a time that somebody really saw you. This to me is the most important thing. If you can't do the other ones, if you don't have the time, just do the work of bringing to mind a kind memory instead of an unkind memory right before you go on the mic or press play or walk on the stage. And usually the juicy kind memories that just have quick hits tend to be moments when someone really saw us, to use your phrase, right? When we just really felt like what we contributed mattered. Maybe it came in the form of a hug or an email or a text or a voice note. Maybe it didn't at all. Maybe it was just you heard it through the grapevine. But bringing to mind that memory and breathing it in as low as you can, letting your body re-feel what you first felt, is the most powerful thing we can do. Prime ourselves for the moment we're about to step in.
What is the memory that you think of?
I scroll through a few of them. I also want to honor that some that used to work don't work as well anymore. And I think that like acknowledging that what used to be juicy now feels like sad is okay, but maybe don't use that one anymore. I love this one from a recent workshop I did where this woman that I really admired, who's in the back of the room, told me afterwards that she said, you, Samara, you held my heart in your hands. And it's like, well, that's nice,
Yeah.
And people talk about having like a smile jar or a file that we keep on our computer desktop of nice things people have said to us, right? I actually don't have that because I'm a chaos monster, but I should. And
it's the artist in you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Correct. But I do keep a bunch of them. I do write them down sometimes, but I also just keep them in my mind, and I commit some of them to memory. Like this woman just said something to me this week, and it was a different thing. But I was like, don't forget that one. Because listen, we all know this, but I'm going to remind you, brains are going to brain. We all are better at remembering what berries kill us than what berries taste juicy, because one has death on the line. That was my strong voice. So our negativity bias means we can't outsmart it. It's great. It keeps us alive. But what do we do with biases? We notice them. We have a second wiser thought. So the second wiser thought in this case is not just here's all of the billion things that could go wrong. Don't do that thing that went wrong that one time. But now a new thought, the positivity bias thought, which is don't forget you also just move people there for you.
And to me, that's what power sounds like.
There's something really there though, right? I mean, to the point that you made earlier about that impossible moment where you have to get the feedback. Here's why this is so sticky. We can tell people stop saying and in vocal fry. Or we can say, how can I help create the conditions for you to really show up and follow through and follow through and follow through? And you know what happens? They stop saying and using vocal fry. This is just an inside out game. It's a spiritual game. And it's just so much bigger than police women's voices or don't police women's voices. It's weird policing our own voices because of millennia of messaging that we have received. And then what we do next. What's our second wiser thought?
Thank you so much, Samara.
Thank you.
I wish everyone could see the video, just seeing how lit up you are about the feedback that you've gotten and things like that. It just shows how powerful the work that you're doing is.
Thank you. Well, and I also really try to model this stuff, like it is a value of mine.
Leading by example, for sure. As we wrap up, where can someone find you if they want to learn more about you and what you do?
My website, Samara Bay, but also, I've mentioned the Substack a few times. I'm really proud of it. It also has been named a 2024 featured Substack on featured publication on Substack. It's called How to Show Up. So it is the book, because I am the book, plus like a sort of an evolution of thought on this.
Awesome. We will include your website and your Substack in the show notes. Thank you for showing up, for doing this important work. And I'm excited to follow along on your journey.
Thank you. Thanks, Chloe. Thank you all.
Thank you for joining me today. If you enjoyed this episode, invite your entrepreneur friends to tune in. Don't forget to connect with me on Instagram at West Haven Coaching. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on today's episode and continue the conversation with you there. And before you go, be sure to download my free guide, 5 Steps to Building Your Authentic Authority, which will walk you through how to grow your thought leadership in a way that's true to who you are and what you stand for. You can find the guide at westhavencoaching.com/steps or follow the link in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. Together, we are changing the faces and voices of thought leadership. Until next time, keep leading with authenticity and impact.